The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University.
Hello and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. Thanksgiving is a time for families to gather and celebrate together. The Pilgrims celebrated the first Thanksgiving to honor the harvest, and beginning a few years later, they had much larger harvests to celebrate each fall. The reason has to do with economics, and specifically the role of property rights in encouraging production. Joining me on EconVersations today to talk about these hidden economics lessons behind the Pilgrims' Thanksgivings, as well as today's modern feast, and my colleague from the Johnson Center, Dr. Dave Hebert. Dave, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So I'm already looking forward to Thanksgiving dinner. I get very excited about Thanksgiving turkey every year, but it turns out that we've all heard the story of the first Thanksgiving, but it turns out that there's some economics that lie behind this, right?
Yeah, so the story that most of us have heard in either our middle school or high school classes or something to the effect of, the Pilgrims came over in 1620 and they had a hard time growing crops until the Indians came over and sort of taught them how to do it, and afterwards everything was great. But while there is a little bit of truth to this story, where in the sense that the Native Americans did teach the Pilgrims some techniques for farming, the real story is an economic one, and specifically it's about the difference between communal and private property rights.
Well, so let's get into this here a little bit here. So, and first, let's make sure we set the setting for everybody, because it might have been a few years since our middle school or high school history. So you already mentioned in 1620 the Pilgrims arrived in Massachusetts. So to put this in perspective, that was near the beginning of the attempts to form permanent colonies here in the New World?
Yeah, I mean, there were a few other instances beforehand. I think Roanoke was established in 1607 or somewhere around there. But Plymouth is one of the more famous ones, the other famous one being Jamestown. But Plymouth was sort of the main one. And so the Pilgrims arrived in December of 1620. They were set back a little bit due to some disputes on contracts, basically with their investment company. And they arrived in December in the harsh winter months. Not exactly a great time to land and try to establish a new colony, but they persevered a little bit, and they were able to build some crude houses and get the ground sort of ready to farm.
And their struggles, in one sense, weren't a surprise, because you mentioned these other early colonies. The Roanoke Island colony disappeared altogether, and Jamestown certainly struggled early on, right?
Yeah, so Roanoke colony, I mean, it's called the Lost Colony because we have absolutely no idea what happened to it. They found a carving in a tree, and that's the last remnants of any sort of sign of that original colony existing. And with Jamestown, we also had some difficulties there. People were starving. They didn't have nearly enough food to feed all the people there. In fact, they were basically starving. I think over the first few years, something like 70% of all the people that came to the New World actually died.
So, put in that context, the fact that the Pilgrims were struggling their first year or so in Massachusetts shouldn't be a huge surprise.
No, absolutely not. It was the norm. And in fact, it became very hard to find people that would be willing to leave England and come over to the New World when they found out that the 1 year survival rate was so low. I mean, imagine if someone said to you, hey, you want to sail to the other side of the world and maybe die in the next year? No. And so it was a very difficult thing to get people to do.
So it was a very hazardous passage, and you still had lots of hazards in the wild, and so when the Mayflower arrived, the folks were suffering, especially that first winter, because as you mentioned, they arrived very late. They didn't arrive in time to be able to plant crops or anything. They had to, I think many of them had to stay on the Mayflower during the whole first few winter months here, right?
That's right. So imagine making a journey across the ocean for several months arriving at the new land, and now you're stuck living on the ship in port, or in what could be considered port at the time, for another few months while the weather is just miserable. So you had cramped living conditions. There was little room for growing anything or even foraging anything in the winter months. I mean, it was a very dire situation for these people.
Now, as you mentioned, they did start to build a few houses and planted some crops the next year, 1621, which would have been their first full year and at the Plymouth plantation. And I guess the first Thanksgiving actually dates to the fall of 1621. But the first couple of years that they were trying to grow crops, they weren't very successful, were they?
They weren't at all. So they had, so what they did is they established sort of a communal property system. And really this system was imposed on them by their investors. And so what that means is that everything that they produced in the New World became sort of common property that was going to be divided between all the colonists and the investment company in the next 7 years. And so anything that they produced became for sort of the common good. And so what we saw were people not really producing a whole lot of food for various reasons. And the first Thanksgiving was very meager. The second Thanksgiving was equally meager, if not more meager, due to people dying and not surviving the first winter. And so it was a very rough time to be in the New World. It was just abysmal.
But then starting in 1623, things changed and the fortunes improved for the Pilgrims. And we know that this was sort of due to a change in the way they organized ownership of food and their food production. And so tell us a little bit about how we know that this was a property rights story.
Yeah, so we have a great detailed history from William Bradford, who wrote in his diary of Plymouth Plantation, and he just basically described everything that was going on for those first few years. And so we know in 1623, what he did was a very radical but a very clever solution. And he basically divided all the land amongst all the families. And there was some discrepancy. If you had a very large family, you got a slightly larger plot of land. But for the most part, everything was divided equally, and you now got to keep whatever was produced on your land. You couldn't sell the land to anyone else, but you could farm it and work it however you wanted, and whatever the land produced was yours to keep. Now we contrast that with what was going on in 1621 and 1622, where anything that I produced basically went into a communal storehouse and was then distributed amongst everyone equally. This is a radically different solution. Now, if I grow corn, I get to keep the corn, or I can sell the corn to my neighbor, or I can give it to my neighbor, or anything of the sort.
So now the idea of communal property, as you mentioned, was put on, was sort of imposed on the initial plantation due to the financing of their venture. But it would also be the kind of thing that many people might, thinking back to Karl Marx's famous saying, that from each according to their ability and to each according to their needs, doesn't necessarily sound like a bad idea for many people. So let's get into this question. So although it might sound good in principle or in the abstract, the philosophical sense, it really runs into some harsh economic realities, right?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a wonderful sentiment, and it is something that personally I think we should strive for. We should strive to have an economic system that promotes the good behavior and the hard work of everyone, and we should have a society that takes care of people. But when you make sort of the redistribution of resources the focus of your economic system, it leads to a lot of malincentives or bad incentives in terms of production. And so William Bradford writes about this in his journal. He says that lots of young men did not think it fair that they would provide things for other people's families and wives, regardless of how hard those other people had worked. We think about lots of other things where if we have sort of these communal property rights, the way that the resources typically get allocated is fundamentally different. It's not based on whether I've produced anything for the community. It's based on either, did I get to the storehouse first? Am I the biggest person and can therefore win in a fight? or am I friends with the person who establishes who gets how much food? And those are completely antithetical to production. What we want is a system that rewards production and penalizes sort of slovenness or not working, but also provides some sort of maybe a basic amount for everyone. But what we had was sort of a guarantee that no matter how hard you worked, you got the same amount of food. And in that sort of a world, one of the strategies you can do is not work. And especially in a situation where observing other people's efforts is difficult. So think about how hard it would be for you to observe whether your neighbor, across town was working hard or if he was hardly working. It might be difficult to detect cheating and punish it.
Now, you mentioned that, and there's a lot of subtleties in there, and subtleties I think that if you haven't studied economics or thought of some of this, are easy to miss. And so, I mean, if you say like, well, you can't like tell if somebody's working hard or not. I mean, you can certainly tell if somebody goes out to the field, though, can't you?
At some level. So we should remember that this was in the 1620s, and so the agricultural production process was very primitive.
Okay.
We didn't have modern fertilizer, we didn't have modern irrigation techniques, we didn't have any sort of real farm equipment other than basic plows.
Right.
And so the production of any field would vary widely, no matter how hard you worked. There could be years where you worked very hard, but very few crops came out. And there could be years where you didn't work very hard and your harvest was bountiful. And so even though we could observe how much each individual family contributed to the overall production, it was still difficult to figure out whether or not they actually worked because the variance or the change in how productive a farm could be was so wide due to factors other than how hard you worked.
And another factor, as recall from reading about was going on here, is that during those first couple of years when they were operating under communal property, it seemed that lots of people were sick all the time, and miraculously, almost by 1623, when they switched over to the private property, people seemed a lot healthier and were out in the fields a lot more. So that's a part of the story too, isn't it?
Yeah, so in the first couple of years, any excuse you could give to sort of justify your not working as hard as you possibly could be easily valid. And especially if someone else couldn't verify whether or not you were sick or anything else, of course you would say, oh, I'm a little sick right now, I can't work today, sorry. And in a system where you get the same amount of output or reward, regardless of how hard you work or regardless of how much you contribute, those sort of things are going to run rampant. But in systems where if you take a sick day, it actually costs you in terms of your production, we tend to see people not claiming to be sick as often.
And then this whole issue of trying to monitor how hard people are working, is to use a term that we in economics like to use to describe this. I mean, that even goes out to looking to see how hard somebody's working when they're out in the field. So you can, if they are out on the field, are they working very diligently and very carefully, or are they sort of like daydreaming, right?
Right. I mean, it's very difficult to quantify or define what hard work looks like in the context of farming in the 1620s.
Right.
So one thing you could do is you could be walking a little bit slower while you're trying to plow and daydreaming instead of pushing really hard. You could maybe you sit down in the corn stalks and take a quick nap in the afternoon. There's lots of ways to sort of, the word that we like to use as economists is shirk. There's lots of ways to basically decrease how hard you're working in sort of an unobservable way, or at least a difficult to observe way.
Now, by contrast, though, I mean, another way people might be thinking about this is to say, well, wasn't it the case that the colonists there at Plymouth Plantation were sort of all in this venture together? They were either going to succeed or fail as a group. And so shouldn't they have been sharing the burdens of trying to forge and trying to basically even survive in this harsh new world, right?
Yeah, I mean, that was sort of the ideal, is that, if we all work together, we'll all succeed together, and if none of us works hard, we'll all fail. Or the idea of, the weakest link in a chain is the one that breaks, and if the chain breaks, everyone suffers. That was very true, and it led to all the problems in 1621 and 1622. The economic system was the broken link, and so what we saw were people starving. But I should be careful and say that I'm not trying to say that there was no scope for sort of communal activity. So Bradford did not say everything will be done by yourself. The only way you can get anything is if you do it yourself. That's not what was said. We had plenty of examples of the entire community working together. One of the most common ones was in raising a barn. So think about how much timber or lumber you would need to basically build a barn. You didn't have cranes to drag it out of the woods. You didn't have any sort of a machine that would lift it up high so you could build the roof. This all had to be done by human hands, and it took the entire community to build it. And so each barn that was built was an effort of the entire community. This is why even today, if you see old barns anywhere, especially up north, they typically, no one will knock them down. Right? So you can see old barns that clearly should be taken down. They're unproductive, they can't be used because they're a danger. But the reason why they don't knock them down is because it was a taboo established in the Plymouth Times that basically said, if you knock down the barn, you are destroying something that the community built for you. And you are hurting or harming the community. And so that taboo persists even to today.
So you're not denying that there are some types of collective tasks where we really do have to work collectively and actually all get together and raise the barn together. But we have to be very careful about which tasks truly are like that and which tasks, I guess, we're too casual saying like, oh, well, this is a team effort, when it's not always a team effort, right?
Absolutely. There are certain things that can be done privately for your own self. So for example, I clean my own apartment. I don't expect the community to do it for me. But there are other things that I do today that require the community. So when I was moving into my apartment, I had to carry furniture up some stairs. I had to have some friends help me because I could not physically do it myself. There was just no way. There are other instances. We have things like any sort of a team exercise in production. So think about any time we have to lift anything. Usually you do that with other people involved, right? These are all forms of communal activity, but we need to be careful about, one, how we establish those teams, and two, as you were saying, the extent to which we rely on teamwork rather than individual effort.
Another thing that economists like to talk about is the division of labor, because it's huge in allowing productivity. So if you could just, before we get into how the division of labor interacts with this, tell us, remind us again, like what exactly is this division of labor?
Yes, the division of labor refers to basically having individual people specialize in particular steps in the production process. So the most famous example of this is Henry Ford implementing the assembly line process for producing cars. Rather than having one person work all day on building a car, Henry Ford implemented the assembly line. And what that did is it allowed each individual worker to specialize in, say, making the wheels. And so this person got very good at making wheels, and then those would be passed on to the person who made the axle, and so on and so forth. And in doing so, we multiplied the amount of production that could happen. Now today, the division of labor is incredibly rich and incredible. For example, I know of a company in Medina, Ohio, that all they do is make very high precision screws that go into your watches and cell phones. And that's it. That's incredible. Think about the difference between working in 1623 and working in 2016. In the 1600s, you had to basically do everything for your household. You had to do the framing inside the house, you had to clear the land, you had to thatch the roof, you had to farm, you had to sew the clothes, you had to do everything. And today, we have roofers whose job is specifically just to make roofs. We have people who specialize in making drywall. We have all sorts of people that are very good at particular tasks, and as a result, each one of us has access to a greater amount of wealth than any person in all of human history.
So to get back to this idea of how we were organizing production back in the Plymouth colony, if it is important to try to divide up tasks, to use the division of labor to the extent that they could have in 1620, which is much less than we could today, wouldn't it be easier to divide up labor if you were growing food sort of communally? Because then you have everybody sort of out there working on the fields. You could have somebody in charge and assign different tasks to different of the colonists and make sure that somebody concentrates on plowing and maybe somebody waters the corn, and then other people are making sure to go through and pick the corn and so forth.
Yeah, that would seem to be the easiest way to do it, is to sort of think of the entire colony as one giant firm, and you have one, let's say the governor, in charge of who does what, and he allocates the people across different tasks. But notice how much information that one person would have to have. They would have to know who was the best at plowing, who was the best at planting corn seeds, who was the best at maybe grinding the corn into flour. These are all sorts of this is all information that's very difficult, if not impossible, to come by without very serious and careful study, if it can even be done at all. Mm-hmm. The alternative is to let everyone sort of figure it out on their own. So the person who's really good at growing corn will discover naturally that they're particularly good at growing corn, and they will be able to do that, and they will specialize on their own. Mm-hmm. So the beauty of private property is sort of that it leads to what Adam Smith described as the invisible hand. People being steered by their own self-interest towards the things that they are the most productive at, and then sharing those things with the entire community through trade and commerce, instead of just by contributing it into a giant storeroom and allowing someone else to redistribute it.
Now, we're assessing this history or what happened in 1621, 1623 with hindsight of a lot of economic knowledge. I mean, we mentioned Adam Smith, but he hadn't written his famous book, The Wealth of Nations, back when the Pilgrims were trying to make their way in the New World, had he?
No, it would be another 150 years or so until Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations. But the thing about economics is, if we're doing it properly, we're not exactly advising people or speaking truths to people that they didn't already know. We're more being a student of society and trying to figure out how it is that all of these things actually work. So it could be the case that, if you or I went back to 1621 and said, hey, listen, you guys should just have private property, right? And we could explain it to them why they should, maybe their lives would have been dramatically improved. But the task of economics is an understanding one, not sort of an advice one. Mm-hmm. And so it could be the case that you and I could have done some positive good. But what we need to think about is both what they knew in 1620 when they were establishing the charter for the community, and also what everyone else knew and what they had to deal with. So the reason why they had their communal property actually made sense if we think about it from the investor's point of view. So the investors basically put up a lot of money to establish a new colony in Plymouth, and they needed some sort of a guarantee that the colonists or the Pilgrims would work for them instead of working for themselves.
You mentioned this, and let's get into this a little bit, because you're talking about the people who are funding the colony. I would think that most people would probably think, well, didn't the Crown and the government of England fund the folks on the Mayflower to go over and set up these new colonies? So wasn't this like a government-led exercise in founding colonies in the New World?
Yeah, that's how most people envision it. But in fact, it was a pure investment by a group of adventurers in England. And what they did is they put up a lot of money to say, hey, we want you to go establish a community. You guys will farm, you'll look for gold, you will basically adventure on our behalf, and we'll take some of the profit from your ventures as well. And so it was a pure investment strategy. But what we needed was what they needed rather, was some way to basically enforce their investment options or their investment strategies. And so let's imagine that you're a pilgrim and I'm the investor. We're separated by about 7,000 miles and months upon months between any sort of communication. So I can't pick up the phone and call you and say, hey, how was this, this month's harvest? Was it good? That's not something that we can do. So we need to have some way to enforce and make sure that the pilgrims are working for the betterment of the company or the investors, rather than working for their own personal gain. And so for this reason, the company wanted to have everything owned communally, including the houses and all the other property that was there, and they would split this between everyone at the end of their 7-year investment.
Now, this seems pretty amazing, because this had to be, we've already talked about the failure of some of the other colonies, and I think I recall reading at one point in time that the Pilgrims put a bunch of goods on a ship to send back to the investors to help make a payment toward what they owed them, and then the French French came in and raided the ship, and so they lost what they were paying. And from the investor standpoint, you never knew if that the French might come in and raid the whole colony and burn it to the ground, and you'd lose your investment total. I mean, this had to be an extremely risky proposition on the part of the merchant adventurers, this company that was funding this.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, coupled with the idea that your payments could be stolen by anyone, including the French, but also Native Americans or anyone really could come in and steal it. And then coupled with that, the high cost of convincing people to actually abandon their livelihood in England and sail across the ocean to settle a new land. It would be incredibly expensive just to convince people to do it, let alone sending enough supplies to last until they can sustain themselves. This was an incredibly expensive endeavor. And so these investors wanted to ensure that they got a return on their investment. They wanted to make sure that the colonists or the pilgrims worked on their behalf and not just for themselves. So imagine if you were a colonist and you got to keep your house, right? So anything that you produce on the weekend or in your house was yours to keep, and anything you produced Monday through Friday was, let's say, mine. Right? You're going to focus all your productive efforts on Saturday and Sunday, and you're going to improve your house, you're going to do all sorts of things like that, and maybe if you have time, you'll work for me during the week. The investors wanted to avoid that, and so they said, look, anything you make is equally ours as well.
Well, Thanksgiving is coming up soon here, and we celebrate Thanksgiving today. Fortunately, we're wealthy enough we don't have to worry about starving to death before the next harvest. But even our modern Thanksgiving dinner that we celebrate and share with our families exhibits a lot of the division of labor, right?
Yeah, so think about where all the different dishes come from. Right, we have pumpkin pies, despite the fact that, at least in my family, we don't grow the pumpkins ourselves. Someone else specialized in growing the pumpkins, and then someone else specialized in turning them into pie. Right, I've never made a pie crust in my life, and I don't think my mother has either, but maybe she has, and if she sees this, I'm sorry, Mom. Right? But it's a wonderful thing to think about how we have such a tremendous division of labor that allows each one of us to have things like pumpkin pie and everything else. I think you can buy a whole pie today for about $4.50, which is incredibly cheap if you think about how hard it would be to make it yourself. And so it's an amazing world that we live in, and it's all thanks to these private property rights.
Well, I know growing pumpkins isn't easy, because we've been trying to at our house for a couple of years in a row, and they keep dying before they produce any pumpkins. So there's a lot of specialized knowledge, I think, involved here as well. Oh, there is. And a couple of my friends try to grow their own crops, and it did not exactly go well. The carrots were about this big. So it's about what our carrots ended up being as well. But, well, looking at that, I'm already getting hungry here with the turkey. Looking forward to turkey and Thanksgiving. Well, thanks for coming on today and telling us a little bit about the economics behind our Thanksgiving feast. And thanks for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.